Okay, the third topic for today's screencast is variables and their roles. Before we can talk about variables, though, we need to clarify the difference between a construct and a variable. So a construct is really the label that we give to our agreed upon sort of generalization of some concept. They actually can't be observed, and because of that, they're sometimes referred to as latent or underlying variables. So the best example of this is intelligence. It's one of the most highly studied constructs out there. Intelligence, in and of itself, can't be observed, but what we do observe are variables or indicators of intelligence, and that's what a variable is. So the construct is the general abstract label that we give to a concept that we agree exists and that we say can be measured through the observation of a set of variables. So there's intelligence, motivation would be another example of a construct, depression, anxiety. But essentially, those are the terms that we use when we talk about and we build theories. We use constructs as a basis to define our theories. So we might say that intelligence predicts success in life, or people who are highly self-efficacious are more motivated to learn. And so we've established a connection between two constructs, and then we can start to potentially build from that and expand on that theory. So constructs are not variables. They are the labels we give to the abstract general terms that we use to build theories. We define constructs in two ways. A nominal definition is our dictionary definition. An example would be intelligence is a combination of a person's cognitive and social abilities. This is a very common definition of intelligence, and it's the basis for most intelligence tests. But that definition in and of itself doesn't really guide you towards what you need to measure. Alternatively, an operational definition does. So an operational definition specifies the things that need to be done, the procedures that need to be implemented in order to measure or manipulate a construct. So we operationalize intelligence as a person's score on the WISC-4 intelligence test. This is what a variable is. A variable is the intelligence test score. It's not intelligence. The variable is actually the score that we observe. And this is important because we don't actually observe constructs. Constructs are our way of describing theory and postulating how we think the world works. When we go to the point of actually conducting a quantitative study, and I should say that when we talk about variables and their roles, we're really situating ourselves within quantitative inquiry. When we go to actually test our hypotheses and test our theories, that's when we need to move to the world of variables. Okay, so just to summarize, intelligence is a construct, whereas the manifest variable or the variable, simply to the variable, are scores on the WISC intelligence test. Okay, so what is a variable? Please ignore the topic 3 at the top there. I'm lucky that this fits under topic 3, but that's a remnant from an old slide. Anyways, a variable describes groupings of attributes. So sex would be the variable, attributes would be male and female. First language could be a variable, attributes would be English, French, Chinese, and the list could go on and on. SES, that's a variable, and the attributes would be lower, middle, and upper class. Occupation, that's a variable. The first few that we've gone through are what we would call nominal variables, where the attributes are just the names of the different manifestations of the variable. The last two, IQ and age, these are continuous variables. So scores exist on a continuum from whatever number, 0 to whatever number. And so IQ is a variable. Age is a variable. Now, the most important way that I want you guys to be thinking about variables is how we describe them in their role with research. So the first important concept to understand with variables is independent and dependent variables. Independent variables are the variable we think has an effect on a dependent variable. So the independent variable is hypothesized or predicted to relate to a dependent variable. This is really synonymous with predictor and criterion. So predictors are the independent variables, and criterions are the dependent variables. What's being predicted is a criterion. Mediators. Mediators are intervening variables. They come between independent and dependent variables. An independent variable will affect a dependent variable through a mediator in some cases. Moderators are probably the hardest type of variable to understand. Moderator variables are variables that change the nature of a relationship that exists between an independent variable and a dependent variable. So a moderator variable changes the relationship between an independent and a dependent variable. And I'll leave it at that for now, and we'll talk more about it in a minute. Extraneous variables are variables that are just not a part of the theory. They have no impact on the way relationships are expected to function. Sometimes it's important to identify extraneous variables and why you think they're extraneous in your research to sort of put to bed any conversation about variables that you've established are not involved. Confounding variables are at play in non-experimental research. So were not measured, are not a part of your study, but could be influencing what you're seeing. And so they should be controlled for. And if they aren't controlled for, then the results of your study may be invalid. Okay, so we're going to spend a lot of time on mediation and moderation. So mediating variables are the explanation for why an independent variable affects a dependent variable. So we can say that we can talk about mediation by using the word indirectly. We say that variable x indirectly affects variable y through its effect on the mediator. So we say that x has an indirect effect on y through the mediator. So we have a world that exists where we can have independent variables that affect dependent variables directly, so there's no mediation happening, indirectly through the mediating variable, or both. You can actually have an independent variable have a main effect or a direct effect on your dependent variable and an indirect effect on the mediating variable. So what does this look like? Essentially, this is a visual representation of theory. And so what you see here are constructs and how we are hypothesizing that they're related to one another. So when we talked about theory earlier, and I said that it would become easier to understand when you see a tangible example, this is what I'm referring to. So here you have a visual representation of theory, and there's so much going on here, and I want you to keep this slide in mind when you're struggling with defining your theory for your research. But essentially, what you see here is three constructs: fairness beliefs at school, academic motivation, and performance. And they're not overly specified at this point because the point is to give you an example that's easy to understand. But what this theory is clearly saying is that students with stronger fairness, or we don't know the stronger part yet, but I'm going to read the hypothesis. Students with stronger fairness beliefs will perform better than students with weaker fairness beliefs because, and that should be bolded, because stronger fairness beliefs result in higher academic motivation. So this is a path model for a theory that suggests that fairness beliefs affect motivation, which in turn affects performance. Or to state it another way, fairness beliefs affect performance through its effect on academic motivation. So you can see the roles of all the variables here are stated in parentheses. Fairness beliefs are the independent variable, academic motivation is the mediator, and performance is the dependent variable. This example of how you state a hypothesis is important as well. What the hypothesis should do is it should tell you who you are hypothesizing about. So the target population, so students. That's a pretty generic. It's not specific enough, but essentially you should give some clear description, label to the population who you are hypothesizing about. And then it provides information about the variables that are at play. So we've got fairness beliefs, we've got performance, so perform better, tells us that the other variable is performance. And then finally we have academic motivation. This theory could be modified. Maybe there's research that's done that establishes that this is true, and someone comes along and says, well, you know what? It's also possible for fairness to have a direct effect on performance. So fairness beliefs has a direct effect on performance. So all I've done here with this slide is add in our direct effect, and it makes for a much wordier hypothesis, but the same ideas are at play here. So we have a visual representation of our theory. We've got mediation happening, so an indirect effect, and we've got our direct effect. So we've got fairness beliefs at school, which is our IV, which is now directly affecting performance, and in addition to that, it's affecting performance through academic motivation, which is the mediator. So how do you say this in a hypothesis? Like I said, it gets a lot more wordy, but again, it's very clear and specific about what's at play. So fairness beliefs are expected to affect performance directly, such that students with stronger fairness beliefs will perform better than students with weaker fairness beliefs. So that first sentence is the direct relationship. Then it goes on to say that stronger fairness beliefs are also expected to affect performance indirectly through its effect on academic motivation, such that stronger fairness beliefs will result in higher academic motivation, which in turn is expected to increase performance. So it took two really long sentences, to state the hypothesis that describes this theoretical model. So our path model shows us the theory. We see mediation in action. You see the roles of the variables are labeled. And this is the kind of thing that you need to be thinking about when you're doing research, educational research in your domains. These kinds of visual representations go a long way in clarifying your understanding of theory to your readers. Okay, moderation. So I told you earlier that moderation and moderating variables are variables that affect the nature of a relationship between two other variables. So essentially you have an independent variable affecting a dependent variable, but that relationship itself changes depending on the moderator variable. So another way to say this is that the nature of the relationship that exists between two variables will depend on the level or value of the moderator variable. When you hear someone talking about interaction, it's actually moderation. So we'll say that the effect of gender on performance interacts with socioeconomic status. Or moderation is the result of an interaction between an IV and a moderator. So what does this look like? It looks like this. So here's our theoretical model. Similar constructs that are at play here. Essentially, what's happening here is we have two kinds of feedback that could be provided to a student. Criterion and normative. Doesn't matter what that means, but for now you know there are two kinds of feedback. And we'll assume that they're going to do an experiment here, randomly assign you to get one or the other kind of feedback. And then they're hypothesizing that this is going to have an effect on the student's fairness beliefs. So if you get criterion referenced feedback, you'll have different fairness beliefs than if you had gotten normative feedback. Okay, so that's the direct relationship. However, by putting this moderator variable, and you see the arrow is pointing to the other arrow, so it's saying that this relationship, this arrow, changes depending on this arrow. So depending on your level of social disadvantage, so how socially disadvantaged you are, this relationship will be different. So how do we say this in words? We say socially disadvantaged students who receive criterion-referenced feedback will have stronger fairness beliefs than socially disadvantaged students who receive norm-referenced feedback. So this first sentence says the only people we're considering are the socially disadvantaged. And we think that when you're socially disadvantaged, number one, and you receive criterion-referenced feedback, you are going to have stronger fairness beliefs than when you are socially disadvantaged and you receive normative feedback, norm-referenced feedback. So we haven't even talked about the socially advantaged people here yet. The second sentence tells us what we expect to see for the socially advantaged students. So the relationship is not even expected to exist for socially advantaged students. So the moderation is to say that you must be socially disadvantaged for us to be able to see this effect at play. If you're not socially disadvantaged, this relationship won't exist. So I haven't labeled these ones, but here's your independent variable, here's your dependent variable, independent variable, and this is your level of social disadvantage acting as a moderator. So if you were going to depict visually in your theory a moderator, this is how you do it. So what does this look like when you see it in results of a study? Essentially what we have here is all of the three variables are represented in this figure. On the y-axis, we have fairness beliefs. So each of these dots represent the average fairness beliefs of people in the different groups. So there are 4 groups that existed in this study. The first group was criterion referenced feedback, this dot right here, socially advantaged. The second group was norm referenced feedback, socially advantaged. Then the third group was criterion referenced feedback, socially disadvantaged. So they started out with an average fairness beliefs of a 2, it looks like. And then the fourth group is norm referenced feedback, socially disadvantaged. They ended up with really low fairness beliefs. So what this figure shows us is that it didn't matter what feedback you got when you were socially advantaged, you ended up with the same fairness beliefs. The average for the people in this group was the same as the average for the people in this group. Alternatively, socially disadvantaged students ended up with much lower fairness beliefs when they received norm reference feedback compared to criterion reference feedback. So this is an interaction. It's an interaction between the independent variable and the moderator variable. So the type of feedback you receive interacts with your level of social disadvantage to affect your fairness beliefs. So study this figure, study this theoretical representation, see if you can understand what's going on here, because we're going to ask you to try and create a visual representation for a hypothesis you see in another study.